ex-MP George Galloway. You were expelled from the Labour Party. He, of course, never was. Some said that he made the party unelectable in the 70s and 80s. But how inspirational a figure was he for you?
In fact, he was my character witness at my expulsion kangaroo court, along with Michael Foot and the leader of the biggest union affiliated to the Labour Party. But it didn't take them long to disregard these star witnesses, and they threw me out. He was, as you've just, I think, in a wonderful package there showed, a really quite majestic figure, head and shoulders above so many of those who bit at his heels at the time. He was absolutely inspirational to millions of people. But there's one thing I think you've got wrong, and the media commentary has got wrong today. The point that's being made over and over again is that most people disagreed with Mr Benn, but they admired him and so on. But actually, on the issues that he stood for, most people agreed with him then and now. From his attempts to bring oil into public ownership in 1974 as the Energy Secretary, right through to the war on Iraq and attitudes to nuclear weapons in the European Union and so on, the majority of British people supported Mr Benn's view on these things. And I think that that's important, because we mustn't allow, if you'll forgive me saying so, Mr Benn to be put in a museum now in a glass case so that we can look upon him and wonder at what used to be. In fact, his point of view is still alive and kicking, and he wasn't the last of the Mohicans. There's plenty of Mohicans left.
Well, and presumably you'd like to count yourself as one of those. But when you say that when most people agreed with him, I mean, how can that be the case? I mean, this was the man who led to the formation of the SDP. This was a man whose political views not only divided his party, but never attracted the sort of support that would have ever elected him to power.
Well, I'd like you to tell me a single one of his trademark policies that is not supported by the majority of British people. He supported the public ownership of gas and electricity and railways. He opposed a new generation of nuclear weapons. He opposed the war in Iraq and so on. And on all of these things, he was right. He opposed the undemocratic character of the European Union. On that, he has overwhelming support in Britain. It's the people making these points, which are entirely wrong, by the way, and I was there. I mean, you said that he split the party by standing against Denis Healey. We could just as equally reverse that and say Denis Healey split the party by standing against Tony Benn. There was a vacancy, there was an election, two men stood for it.
Right,
one didn't split the party by standing,
let's
if the other one didn't.
Let's not split hairs over over the party and the Labour Party. But what about him as a man? So, I mean, so he stood for you as a character reference. What was it about him as an individual, as a character, a man who obviously had, I mean, huge conviction, even if you didn't agree with his political views?
He was a prince amongst men. He wasn't actually an aristocrat. His father's viscountcy was given to him as a peerage by the Liberal Party, who he had served. So he didn't have blue blood, Mr Benn, but he did, of course, come from a wealthy background and a very distinguished one. But he was a prince amongst men. He was the gentlest, most honourable, most filled with integrity of any of the political figures of this age. I mean, he put up with all of this backbiting and media demonization, which you'd have to have been there at the time. Think Scargill, Crowe, Livingston wrapped together, doubled, trebled, and that's how bad it was. But he endured it all with a smile, without a bad word. He was far more sanguine about it than I would or could have been. He was a gentleman through all of that. And in the swirling morass that British politics has become, he really stood head and shoulders out and above it all.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about, you know, your own sort of career compared to his, because, I mean, he never resorted, did he, to any sort of gimmickry or you know, sort of self-publicity, which perhaps...
Thanks very much.
Well, I mean, in terms of, you know, Big Brother appearances and things like that, because he didn't need to, did he?
He was very innovative. You see, this is a point. He didn't, you're right, do that, but I don't think he would have ruled it out. He was the man who pioneered so many things in the 1960s, post codes, postage stamps that didn't just have the Queen's head on them, TSR2, Concorde, nuclear power, He tape recorded his own interviews with the BBC and others in the 1960s because he didn't trust you to faithfully report what he said. No one had ever done any of these things before. He was a really progressive, innovative man. He summed up Mr. Wilson's promise of this white-hot heat of the technological revolution that Labour tried to bring about in the 1960s. So I don't think that you should rule out that Mr. Benn wouldn't have tried a trick or two to get a wider message across. But he was, I think this is common currency. He never had a bad word to say personally about anyone. Even Tony Blair, when I asked him if he'd appear in my forthcoming documentary, The Killings of Tony Blair, he declined on the basis that it all sounded rather too personal. So that's the kind of man he was, but his principle was ironclad. No one would ever be able to accuse him. A man who grew more left-wing as he grew older, which is the opposite, of course, of most Labour politicians. He never compromised on principle. He was ironclad on that to the end.
Yeah, and Harold Wilson, as we heard in that report by Ben Wright, describing him as a man who immatured with age in terms of his radicalism. Is that what he was getting at, do you think?
Well, Mr. Wilson started out a very great hope for Labour people, but he gave up prematurely, having himself rather over-matured with age. So I think we'd put that rather nasty comment by Mr. Wilson down to his premature maturity.
George Galloway, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.